Welcome to Steve Nallon Ghost Stories. This episode, the startling diary of a worried mother, the strange case of the unaccountable shadow.
Well, the inspiration for this strange case of the unaccountable shadow came in two parts, really. So my neighbours went on holiday and I went next door every day for 2 weeks to feed the cat. And when they came back, they said, well, thanks for feeding the cat and thanks for sitting on the kitchen floor and playing with her. I said, well, how did you know that I was sitting on the kitchen floor? They said, oh, well, there's a camera there. And I didn't even know there was a camera. So I mentioned this to a friend of mine who does home tutoring. And she said, did you know, sometimes when I go into houses, there's one of these sort of camera things that's hidden behind a cactus plant or something. And so the parents can see her home tutoring. But they hide it. But she said, I can see the little green light. And I said, well, watching you, teach, that's a bit paranoid, isn't it? And then I thought, paranoid, well, that's great, because paranoid is the beginning of a psychological horror. So that was one aspect of it. And then the other aspect is the unaccountable shadow. And I did want to write a ghost story, whether it was a shadow or a shadow ghost or whatever. And I talk about a load of them in the essay in the book. I think my favorite, though, is by Edith Nesbit's, called The Shadow. And it's not so much an actual ghost. It's more of a shadow of the past sort of haunting the present. And the actual phrase unaccountable shadow, which is, I love the phrase, actually comes from a H.R. Wakefield story, which I think is called He Cometh and He Passeth By. So that was the sort of origin, really, of the strange case of the unaccountable shadow.
So what's the story behind the story this time?
Well, the story behind the story is partly the fact that the story has another story going on within it. And here it might be useful to throw out a couple of literary terms. The first one is something called intertextuality. And that is where an established story somehow becomes incorporated into your story. And I mention that because of your film choice, we'll talk about later, gets a mention of Arthur Conan Doyle. And then there's something called metatextuality. And metatextuality is fiction about fiction. So either there's a sort of a knowingness in the fiction that it sort of is playing with the tropes of a particular genre, like Scream does with horror, and also like Cabin in the Woods is sort of playing with it, the whole concept of it. And then there's another level where it's a fiction that knows it's a fiction because it breaks the fourth wall, and that's rarer in horror, but it's obviously there in films like Wayne's World and so on. There's another concept which is infranarrative, and basically this is the idea that somehow your story has the echo of a classic myth. And in horror, I would say that the most popular one would be Faust, because you find the sort of Faust legend explored in Angel Heart, and Little Shop of Horrors is a Faust story. And I'd say a more recent one would be Sinister. So, and the other concept, pretty obvious one, is homage, where your story is presented or borrows, the style of somebody else's work. And I was watching a documentary recently about John Carpenter and how he really admired Howard Hawks, and we'll probably talk about this later, but Dario Argento was a big fan of Alfred Hitchcock, and it's there as well. But these terms, intertextuality, metatextuality, infranarrative, and homage, they're not. I don't think they're strictly definable in terms of boundaries. Now, I would say that my own story is not homage, and it's not fiction about fiction, but there's elements of intertextuality, certainly, and also infranarrative, because I think it's a story about a divided self, or a divided self within it. And the other point, very quickly, is structurally, it's similar to Henry James's Turn of the Screw, because it's framed as a document that has come into somebody's sort of possession, and you don't know whether the person who's written the document is sane or not, and ultimately you've got to decide. Now, the thing about talking about this is that it's very difficult to talk about anything else, otherwise you give away the plot.
Right,
you give away the twist. So,
and that's often the problem with, certainly in film. I was thinking about this with the film choice when we get to it, that what might be quite fresh and new, and the ideas are very creative in the 70s, 80s. I think by sort of Scream being the high point, and then after that, possibly now, the audience maybe are not as interested in meta films as they were. And I was thinking about this earlier on, quite a lot, like self-awareness and comment on their own nature. Like it's almost overused. But when the film came out that we're going to talk about, it was a real wild ride and very unusual. So I guess it's about freshness as well. I didn't, like I say, with your story, I didn't feel that it was a like there were common tropes. It was a nice mixture of the modern and the and the old.
Well, I was aware that it was a psychological horror, and I've always been a big fan, actually, more of the movie versions of Turn of the Screw, particularly The Innocents. I think that's one of the finest ghost stories that there's ever been. But the real difference, as it were, with my story to Henry James's is the concept of the shadow and what the shadow is. And then I did a lot of research into the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and there's some shadows mentioned in there, and I thought, this is, thank you very much, Robert Louis Stevenson, for putting in mentions of shadows within your own story, because the more I researched Jekyll and Hyde, the more Jekyll and Hyde I was able to incorporate into my story. This wasn't so much that I was sort of stealing it or anything like that. It was that it becomes so important in the climax of the tale. But as ever with these things, it's very difficult to talk about, because if we talk about it, we'll give away the end. It was fun to write, actually. I quite enjoyed it, writing in a voice of somebody, I don't know, who can't sleep, gets up at 3 a.m. and stuff, and he's writing immediately, so that all the dates and times I had to do checks on.
Steve, what have we got in store for this episode's extract reading?
Well, in the research I did, I discovered a lady called Alison Cunningham, who Stevenson called Cummy, and she looked after the family. She was sort of nurse, not governess, but a sort of nurse, and she had very distinct views about religion. She was very, very strict, and I've sort of incorporated a bit of that into the story, and then there's a bit in the story where the lady who's doing the teaching starts asking the son Nathan about what he reads in the Bible.
There were many religious references in Jekyll and Hyde, said Mrs. Higgins, and Nathan would get extra marks if you were able to quote a few examples. Did Nathan know, for example, what the Babylonian finger meant? Nathan didn't speak, but I saw his hair shaking. Mrs. H. then opened the Bible and asked Nathan to read from where she'd put a post-it note. Nathan has never been brought up to believe in silly fairy tales, and so I was very pleased when I heard him say a hand couldn't just appear out of nowhere. Mrs. H. agreed, but then said the reference to the candle might suggest it was the shadow of a hand on a wall. She then got up, went to the window and drew the curtains. She then came back, switched on the lamp and angled it so it lit up the wall. Then, putting fingers to the light, she cast a silhouette of a rabbit. This she then turned into an elephant by sticking out 2 thumbs for tusks, and, upon moving her fingers, the elephant became a cat. Nathan laughed and said, it couldn't be Smoky because he only had 1 ear. Mrs. Higgins said they'd best get back to work, but at least he was now sure to remember about the Babylonian finger if it came up in the exam. Strangely enough, even when Mrs. Higgins lowered her hands, a dark shape remained on the wall where she'd cast her shadows. Due to Mrs. Higgins' allergy, I was worried it was Smoky, who is as black as his name suggests. Only, as I was staring at this shadow, I heard Smoky purring under my duvet, where he sometimes likes to sleep. But if not his, then what was this unaccountable shadow? A mother does worry.
An old-fashioned open razor. I'd never written it.
This episode's film pairing, Tenebrae, by Dario Argento. Dario Argento has always been there in my horror film journey, somebody who I have watched nearly all of his films now. And this is probably my second favorite after Suspiria. If I did a ranking on my channel, so that's why it's clear in my mind where this is. I could have gone with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I could have gone Hammer, but I really wanted to think about the author, and I really wanted to think about somebody who's worried, not necessarily a worried mother, but a worried narrator, a worried lead character. However, without giving too many spoilers, because I do want people to watch this. And to be fair, it's been around a long time, so spoiler warning. We're going to talk about Tenebrae. From 1982, by the way, so you've had time to watch it. The unreliable narrator, the unreliable author in this story, the paranoia in this story, trusting yourself, trusting others. It is the ultimate example of that, really. Of it confounds, it confuses, it comments. It really does comment on Argento and his personality. If you say to Argento, your last film was too violent, too sexual, too upsetting, too disturbing, then he'll say, well, wait till you see my next film. And this is that next film. So this is to confound the critics. This is to give them the proverbial, well, I won't say, but yes, to tell them to go away. And
two fingers, but the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was trying to think of a nice way of putting it. Peter Neal is a fantastic character. He's unnerving as a protagonist. And there's a shift there with our opinions of him, his opinions of himself, the opinions of other characters on him. It does have metafictional elements. However, when that was quite unusual in this genre, it certainly wasn't overused, and it's wild. Plus, the acting in this film, I wasn't that familiar with Anthony Francescosa. John Saxon, I love, absolutely love everything John Saxon. Daria Nicolodi, who has got that real link to Dario Argento as a screenwriter, actress. She's just such a big personality in those films, and really as we've said before, I guess she could be almost like the Deborah Hill of Dario Argento's films. So yes, there's lots of dualism, and okay, it's not story-wise, it's not exactly the same as your story, but I hope you can understand or see where I'm coming from.
Well, tenebrae means shadow, doesn't it? I mean, it's the word itself, and it's interesting because it's not a ghost shadow. He is shadowed in the story. As almost as the sort of second version of himself. I mean, you're right about there's intertextuality in that there's a direct reference to Arthur Conan Doyle, of Hound of the Baskervilles, and we get a hound in the story. We get the hound, Doberman coming in. It's really, I suppose, a fictional writer who's writing a fiction about an insane killer. And without giving away the ending too much, you just have to reword some of the words in the sentence I've just said and work out who the killer is. And what I've read about it is that it was actually inspired by a stalker fan who sort of started sort of pestering him. So it's got elements of misery. Stephen King story. I mean, I noticed that. There's elements of repressed memory in it, which is there in 2 or 3 of my own stories, actually. For the Hell of It has an element of repressed memory, and Under the Mistletoe is ultimately about repressed memory. And it's actually also used, I noticed, in an Agatha Christie Murder is Announced. And it's almost the same trope when somebody said, do you know, I think I might have actually spotted, I can now think about, I can sort of picture in my mind who the murderer was, and they both get slashed to bits. I mean, really, listen, it's a slasher movie for people who read The Guardian. That's sort of what it is, I think. And I think it's a brilliantly put together. And you can see his homage as well, talking about the meta-textuality side of it. Its knowingness. So there's that scene where the literary agent, I think, is waiting in the square. You've got the horror of empty spaces, which is in other of his movies. But the waiting in the square, it's very Hitchcock. It's very The Birds, and also to a degree North by Northwest. It's playing games all the way through it from the opening. He's there, he is on his sort of cycle, whatever he is, and then the car comes up with all his luggage in it, so you're disorientated from the very beginning, and that's sort of what I can absolutely see the link with my story, not just that it's got the same word but in Latin of shadow, but really the whole disorientation and the incorporating of other texts in the story itself. So, and I didn't know it. I'd never seen it. I'd seen Suspiria, but I'd never seen Tenebrae. And now I've seen it about 6 times. The duality that I have is more of a sort of divided self to a degree, but the duality that Dario Argento has is all the way through the film. There's 2 killers, there's 2 lovers, there's 2 pills, there's 2 statues, there's 2 pairs of red shoes, there's 2 car crashes, and then there's 2 scenes where people get their hands caught in a door. There's 2 sets of car keys. There's aeroplanes, 2 sets of aeroplanes. I mean, it's got 2 all the way through it.
There's like an imaginary city and the real city as well.
It's just, it's a game. It's very much a game. I don't think my story is a game quite in the same way. One of my other stories is Who Fed the Cat. That really is a sort of game playing story that we'll talk about on that episode. But no, I absolutely loved Tenebrae, and as I say,
great.
I think it's one of the ones that I'm going to keep returning to.
So Scott's artwork for this story, let's delve into that a little bit.
Well, here we are on my T-shirt, and there's the bigger version of it. We had fun with this because we always sort of met up and chatted about stuff, and Scott was sort of wanting to know what angle the camera should be on the shelf. And I just remember being in the middle of a pub and sort of standing up and describing it. And then he said, well, how do you imagine the shadow would be? And then I had to sort of stand in a funny position, and then he thought it should be a rabbit. And then there was a question of whether or not the shadow in her head should be seen. I said, yeah, you've got to have the monster. You've got to have the monster that she sees through, this thing here. And yeah, it's a sort of her POV, but it's that we've talked about this elsewhere to a degree, but there's in modern horror, the camera and what the camera records becomes an important part of the story. The Ring, a pretty, obvious one. But there's a film I watched recently called Lake Mungo, where there is some sort of found footage, and you can't actually tell whether it's a ghost or not in the found footage. I won't go into the whole plot, but they find some footage in a mobile phone, and it's that thing where I really wanted to include in the collection a story that had modern technology in it, because if you trace the history of the ghost story, every time there's a new invention, like the telephone, horror writers, ghost story writers suddenly like to use the new invention. E.F. Benson did that, and so this story was that, and we don't really see the teacher's face, and so the focus in the image is very much on very centrally it's on the reflection of his fingers, and actually not everybody has seen the monster. And I've shown it to people. The way he's created it is that your focus is definitely on the center of the image, and once you see the monster, once you see the shadow monster, you can't not see it.
Steve, your story pairing for this episode's tale.
Well, it's another Robert Louis Stevenson tale called Markham, and it came out a year before the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Let me just read a tiny bit of it. It's basically a man in a shop, and he suddenly sees a strange thing in front of him. The newcomer. The newcomer seemed to change and waver like those of the idols in the wavering candlelight of the shop, and at times he thought he knew him, and at times he thought he bore a likeness to himself, and always, like a lump of living terror, there lay in his bosom the conviction that this thing was not of earth and not of God. Well, I've chosen that because it's another story about duality, and it's a theme that's in Robert Louis Stevenson. And it was there, of course, in Dorian Gray, and it's very modern in the sense that the substance is a tale of duality and split identity. We've talked before about this particular monster and sort of category mistakes. So this is really an example of fusion, where two come together. But what you get in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and also in Markham to a degree, is fission, where there is a sort of separation. And I think it's a fear in horror that really comes from the fact that it's challenging our understanding of ourself and our unity of a self. We sort of like to think that there's just me and just you and just us, and we're sort of the same. But these stories challenge that idea of unity of self, and it's there all the way through ghost stories. It's there in Charles Dickens's The Haunted Man. Henry James covered it to a degree in The Jolly Corner, and Edith Wharton wrote one called The Triumph of the Night, and it also there in Sheridan Le Fanu. So it's that thing. What's interesting in this in the Markham story is that Mr. Hyde is a horrible creature, but this particular doppelganger is it's almost his conscience. It's almost like an angel spirit leading him to goodness, as opposed to Mr. Hyde that plays with his sort of more evil side. But so what I really like about the story is that it's a sort of mirror image of a story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it's still playing with the same theme.
So as a boy, I remember reading From a Railway Carriage by Robert Louis Stevenson, and I really did love his poems. They were so visual. There was lots of movement in them, which always kind of grabbed my attention. I guess when we're talking about duality and being able to write about completely different subjects, Robert Louis Stevenson's a fantastic example of that.
Yeah, and he was writing at a time when duality was pretty much everywhere. It's there in H.G. Wells's Time Machine, because you very much the above ground and below ground, which reflected Victorian society. So many people working below ground in the coal industry. Interestingly, nobody knows exactly where he got the term Jekyll from. But there was somebody, I think, called Walter Jekyll, who he would have been aware of, who was almost certainly homosexual. And in fact, he had lots of homosexual friends, and people have seen the duality to some degree in his work as a reflection of a world of Victorian society that many people had double lives. And so it's that sense of, in the Victorian world, people being two people, always being two people.
That's fascinating.
Also the two levels of society, the upper and the lower. So it's a theme that's very much in late Victorian and also Edwardian fiction.
That is fascinating. I'd always assumed, with jackals, like a jackal being like a predator, like opportunistic, I like an animalistic side. I'd never really considered the sort of political or even like personality switches beyond the animalistic, which is the way I'd always seen it.
Well, it's slightly off topic, but there's a double identity in the importance of being earnest, and the importance of being earnest is basically about, earnest. You sort of tell the truth, and yet there's a double identity in that. I don't think that Robert Louis Stevenson was making a point about homosexual culture of the late 19th century, but I do think he's playing with the idea of people's morality on the surface being one thing and below something else is happening, not in terms of homosexuality, but certainly in terms of the judges that use prostitutes, and so on. So it's that level of duality and that sense of people having one public life and one private life. Interestingly, the back door is where we see Mr. Hyde. We don't see him at the front door, and this sense of somebody having sort of two personalities, which is exactly what Jekyll and Hyde. It's a fascinating area to study. I think
I keep thinking of Christopher Lee's character in the film, just because he's much more awful than the protagonist. Even he's just an odious character. He must have really enjoyed playing it, because he's normally just going, "Ugh," and he gets to play this sort of wild character who isn't going through a change, just happens to be that sort of horrible member of society who gets away with terrible behavior because of their place and in the hierarchy of things. So it's interesting that you mentioned that as a kind of world building understanding of that story.
And I think he would also have been, Robert Louis Stevenson would have been aware of the werewolf tradition, because that's sort of what we're playing with.
Yeah.
And since you've mentioned Christopher Lee, I will raise you Oliver Reed and The Curse of the Werewolf.
Oh yeah,
which is a great Hammer film. But again, it's dealing with the divided self. Obscure, but hopefully interesting fact is that a Victorian novelist called Walter Besant was founder, incidentally, of the Society of Authors. In 1881, wrote a short story called The 10 Years Tenant, about a scientist who acquires a supernatural power that means he hardly changes. This all goes wrong, and then he confesses it, and it's very similar in structure to the tale we've been talking about. And bizarrely, the name of the character is Montague Jekyll. Oh. Now, nobody knows whether or not Robert Louis Stevenson would have been aware of this story. He would have been aware of the writer, but he may not have been aware of this story. But I suppose the point I'm making is that I'm always aware that when you're writing anything, story, you're standing on the shoulders of others. And I think we've talked about this before, where in the modern world of horror, it's very postmodernistic. All the stories that we see are very much aware of the stories that came before, and all I'm saying really is that the story of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was sort of already written, whether or not Robert Louis Stevenson knew about it or not, 4 or 5 years, 4 or 5 years before.
Wow. Well, mine isn't as much about classic horror in as such as we talked about Dario Argento being quite an obtuse, or if you say left, he'll go right kind of personality. And I thought, what is a really small microcosm of that? And one of it was to do with the lighting in Tenebrae. So when we think of scary films or spooky films, we often think of the dark. And of course, as we said, the name of the film gives us a clue that there's going to be shadows and things. So when Argento was coming up with the ideas for how this was going to look, he decided to go the exact opposite of that. So what we've got, instead of darkness and shadows, which obviously were tenebrae or has a reference to in Latin, his orders were make it as bright as possible. Now, there were still a few shadows that are needed within it. And even though he says that he wanted it to be as realistic as possible. Now, if anybody who's watched the film would not say that this is a particularly realistic film, the director of photography, and I'm not going to butcher his name, but I think it's Loowski, his thought was that Argento was watching a lot of the big, bright American cop shows. And that's what he wanted to see on the screen at that particular moment. So I just thought that was a really interesting take on how his brain works, and possibly that, you know, not every horror that we see, to make it horrific, does it have to be very, very dark, almost hard to see. There are different ways of kind of reaching that, because I do find Tenebrae a really off-putting and unsettling film, and it is bright and neon. And the only thing I can think of that reminds me of that is the Ryan Gosling, I think it's Only God Forgives, and a few films that have that, or maybe Drive. But yeah, I was just wondering what you thought about that, how he seems to just go the opposite direction when it comes to the lighting.
Yeah, and also the colors. The colors are so strong.
Yes.
But there is one scene in it though where it did remind me of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because we sort of see a strange transformation via a shadow on a wall. And it's sort of reminiscent of those sort of versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where they can't afford the transformation, so it's done via a shadow where somebody does a transformation, and it's done via a shadow on the wall. And in a way, I think that must be the only shadow that's in Tenebrae, ironically. And it's a great little scene, but no, it's a fascinating film on every occasion. And actually it reminds me, looking at it, of Columbo, because it's just slightly too well lit. You know, Columbo were never dark. It was never a film noir-y stuff. It's got that look of late 1970s sort of cop shows like Columbo. So
well, that does tie in. That does tie in exactly with what their conversations were about at the time, and it probably isn't something that I think most people would even consider. It's one thing that I think people mostly talk about Argento films are the visuals, and I think often going the opposite direction creates something completely new. And in this case, I don't think I've seen a film like Tenebrae. I don't think I've seen a film like Suspiria. I would say Suspiria as well, in terms of lighting and mood and color, particularly color, really unsettles me. Like, I find that film, I don't tend to sit and shake and shiver over films, but Argento has that power over me. And I guess he's so unpredictable that even he doesn't know what he's going to do next.
Well, I think we should mention the red and the blood. I mean, that's one of the most famous scenes where, you know, the arm is chopped off and the sort of spray, and it's there in the substance. You know, in the recent film, The Substance is very not a homage to Tenebrae, but there's definitely, I don't know how many gallons of blood were used, but it's slightly more than Dario Argento.
Oh yeah, and the bright lights as well. The bright lights, you can almost feel them on you. And this might not be the place to say it, but I feel Demi Moore was robbed. I think she should have won the Oscar. So
well, I voted for her in the BAFTAs, but I hope I was hoping she'd win, but you know, anyway, that's a whole. They'll be still talking about her not winning in 20 years' time. My thought, anyway.
Yeah, I think you're right. My final take on this tale, on this episode's tale, is really about imagination. And I absolutely love the idea of what we imagine to be true, the reliability of narrators, who's telling the story. And this is, for me, a very imaginative story because of the modern technology element, but the classic shadows and what we find in the shadows. I absolutely love that balance. And I think, to go back to what we were talking about right at the start, and we were talking about sort of films that have become metatextual and have this knowingness. For me, when I read this story, I was with it all the way to the end, and I was surprised and engaged. Am I allowed to say there's a twist?
Yes, you're allowed to say it, but not what it is.
Not what it is. Yeah, and I didn't fall. I didn't kind of go and like, and I know this. I got right to the end, and I was happily surprised. So yeah, that's really my takeaway. I guess the theme of that overarching ramble would be imagination.
My takeaway is sort of similar, but from a different perspective. And I've sort of realized that many of the stories I tell in the book involve madness, which is a sort of imagination gone crazy, really.
Yeah.
It's there in I Was Once a Haunted House. It's very much there in Who Fed the Cat. And to a degree, the Return of the Handbag. And when I was rereading all the stories, I sort of realized that, madness is in a third of them. But my father was schizophrenic. And he heard voices and he saw things that weren't there. And I suppose this story, although it's sort of technical because it's got, Robert Louis Stevenson and Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde running through it, is in some ways quite a personal story. When I was putting this collection together, I really wanted different ghost traditions. And there's in the theatre, there's always the theatre ghost. So the next episode, it's the ghost light, and pretty much the whole tale set in a theatre. Oh.